Has a piece of media ever really hit you emotionally? I'm not just talking about hard-hitting individual moments. I'm talking about the experience as a whole. One where, after coming out of it, you know that you'll remember it for the rest of your life. It's something that can change you. I consider myself fortunate enough to have had this sort of thing happen with many fantastic works across all sorts of different mediums. But easily the most common one I've had these experiences in is video games. The interactive nature of video games gives its players something potentially much easier than any other medium: motivation. The progression of the story, the world, and the characters inhabiting it are all dependent on the player's actions. On paper, it kinda sounds like games might be the ideal way to experience a piece of media. And, they can be, at least I think so. But if the story is uninteresting, the world is boring, and the characters are bland, then odds are most people won't even see it through to the end. That's only when things go wrong. When things go right, though, video games have created some of the most beautiful memories that I still hold dear. These memories where I'm so moved with emotion, I can't help but cry. Xenoblade, Shin Megami Tensei, Kingdom Hearts, Paper Mario, Ace Attorney, The World Ends With You, Final Fantasy, Umineko, Metal Gear. I could keep going on, but that would only continue to remind me of how much of a softie I am. However, there was one game that I distinctly remember being the first to resonate with me this much. The very first video game to ever make me cry was Klonoa 2. So you might be wondering how a game that looks like this was and still is able to make me so emotional. There's not exactly one definitive answer to that. There are so many factors, big and small, that make this experience what it is for me. That's what I want to spend this video trying to explore. And I don't think there's any better place to start than the story of how I first found Klonoa 2. The year was 2001. I, dramatically represented by Puddin, was accompanying my uncle, dramatically represented by Haas Delgado, on a trip to Best Buy. But this was no ordinary trip. We were here to pick up my uncle's brand new PlayStation 2 console. I didn't know it at the time, but this simple video game console would become home for numerous life-changing experiences, some of which I probably still haven't even experienced yet. And on this momentous occasion, my uncle graciously allowed me to pick out the very first game I could call my own for it. He was picking up Metal Gear Solid 2, yet another game that would make me cry several years down the line, though for very, different
You'll ruin your eyes playing so close
reasons.
to the TV.
What are you talking?
The selection of games was pretty small for someone of my distinguished taste. Sports games, racing games, anything with an ESRB rating higher than an E, they were all off the table. This meant that the only game left was Klonoa 2. I had seen the original Klonoa available to rent a couple times from the local Blockbuster, but had never actually played it. This North American box art for the sequel was certainly doing its job, appealing to my 90s kid gremlin brain. Hat turned backwards, looking cool on a board, wind blowing through his ears. I was sold. Excitement and anticipation swirled within me as we checked out, growing even stronger as we rode home and my uncle set up the system. It was time for me to play. I began a new game from the adorable start screen and immediately began to fall in love. The premise of Klonoa 2 is pretty basic and what you might expect from a mascot platformer targeted at young children, though that's just on the surface. Klonoa is summoned to the world of Lunatea by a mysterious voice desperately calling out for help. He's almost immediately recognized as the legendary Dream Traveler, someone who's foretold to bring harmony and peace to Lunatea. How is this done? By traveling to the 4 kingdoms, ringing a special bell in each one, and gathering 4 elements associated with different emotions. Lalakusha, the kingdom of tranquility, Joylant, the kingdom of joy, Volk, the kingdom of discord, and Mira Mira, the kingdom of indecision. These elements need the power of a priestess to manifest them, and Priestess in Training Lolo just so happens to be the first person Klonoa meets upon arriving. Oh, and Popka was there too. Popka is neat. Together, the trio travel all across the world in search of the elements, hoping to save the day with the power of shiny things. I had played Brave Fencer Musashi and Ocarina of Time by this point in my life, so random objects being necessary to avert cataclysmic consequences was just something that made sense. The characters are simple, which is fine considering the game's target audience. What they lack in complex motivations, they more than make up for in charm. Take Klonoa himself, for instance. He's a good boy who likes to do good things. That's it. That's his entire driving force as a character. However, he's also silly and kind of dumb. I love this part where he's in front of this river and he just has this look of sheer despair on his face because the poor guy can't swim. Then there are the moments where he exudes total confidence. I think this is one of the only platformers I know of that has a dedicated taunt button. Have to end every boss fight like this. It's just the rules. 2 more great examples are essentially your rivals, Leorina and Tat. They're treasure hunters who butt heads with the main characters in their pursuit of the elements. They both have sharp, distinct features that make them immediately recognizable. Leorina has her purple and crimson color palette, a golden headpiece to accent it, and an exaggerated cowlick that makes her feel antagonistic. Tat has a more playful appearance with very bright cat eyes, a monochrome palette, and a little spring tail thing she bounces around on. They play off each other really well, too. Leorina is the more stern and straightforward of the two, while Tat likes to mess around and have fun while causing trouble for Klonoa. And like any good rival character, of course Leorina gets a weapon that's pretty much the exact same as the main characters. These are the types of things that make them memorable. The game may not have many characters, but it makes use of the ones that it does have by utilizing chemistry between them. So what's the actual game like? Much like its predecessor, Klonoa 2 is a simple action platformer that combines 3D environments and level design with movement that's restricted to a 2D plane. The closest comparison I can think of that I've actually played myself would be Kirby 64, which is secretly the best mainline Kirby game. Klonoa can jump and then use his floppy ears for a slight hover on his own, but the gameplay really opens up with the wind bullets he can shoot from his ring. They allow you to capture most enemies and transform them into this cute blorb. You can then either throw this blorb like a projectile or pounce off it in midair to get another jump. And that's really it for the core moveset of the game. Its simple nature made it really easy for me to pick up and play as a kid. Along with that simplicity, though, came a flexibility that allowed each stage you play through to feel distinct. Not just in aesthetic, but in the key moments of gameplay within them. This first level has you shoot out of a cannon before landing on a giant seagull thing and riding it to an island, as an example. You never see them again after this. The game is filled with these kinds of unique set pieces. The levels in Joyland are some of the best. In the first one, you explore a carnival ground filled with a ton of attractions. You got a game booth, a rocking boat ride, big top performers, a haunted house, a roller coaster, all capped off with a chase on a merry-go-round. These are all implemented in a way that's simultaneously easy to grasp and rewarding to overcome. The second one was easily my favorite growing up. It's a giant water ride, but instead of riding in a log like a lame person, we get to go on a surfboard. This level is the box art. It is also a vehicle segment in a platformer, which are notorious for containing some of the most god-awful, pace-destroying gameplay in the history of the medium. Not here, though. It takes the same simple mechanics from the main platforming gameplay and essentially turns it into an auto-scroll level, but way more fun. Once you're done with those two stages, you get to fight a boss. The boss fights in this game are another major highlight. Leptio here is one of my favorites. Bold, bright colors catch the eye right away. A creepy, eyeless smile on what I assume is his face makes sure he's intimidating immediately. And perhaps most importantly, a fun gimmick that keeps you engaged with the fight. After getting hit, he gets knocked over into a rolling state that can damage you, but if you're good enough, you can keep hitting him back and forth, even ending this part of the fight in a single cycle if you're good enough. But this is just the first phase. You see, every boss in this game has a second phase where new attacks and mechanics get introduced. Leptio's second phase has him put on, whatever this drill armor is, and becomes totally invulnerable to damage if you try to hit it. And he's almost totally covered in this armor. What hitting him does do is knock him over into that same rolling state from before. It's only now that he can actually be damaged. You have to position yourself directly across from him while he's rolling in it like it's some sort of giant hamster wheel, then throw an enemy at him while he's exposed. It's a neat way to make use of the 3D space, and the game continues to get creative with it. The gameplay never stops feeling fresh, and it still finds ways to build off of concepts it's already introduced. Okay, so the game is fun to play. That's cool. But what does that have to do with, the whole point of the video? Well, with the game designed the way it is, I think it immerses us as the player in a powerful way. We start to feel like we have a part to play in this story, a purpose for being in this world, and more to learn from its characters. With this foundation of attachment it's carefully built, it begins to craft moments that touch on something meaningful. One of the best instances of this comes from my favorite level of the game now as an adult, the Moonlight Museum and the Kingdom of Indecision. This level is filled to the brim with puzzles, flipping gravity around to get to certain areas, paying attention to mirrors that show hidden parts of the room, using a special type of monster that absorbs other monsters to break crystals. It pulls out all the stops. All the while, there's this wistful, almost melancholy music playing. There's something about this place that just feels empty. In spite of the cute enemies running around and the different art pieces on display, it's like this place exists in a void, completely separate from everything else. The one person Klonoa and crew run into at the entrance of the museum talks about art being a reflection of the soul, and that the mirrors here are a reflection of the past. At the end of the level, one of the mirrors they come across shows a glimpse of Lolo's past. She's been bullied her whole life for trying and failing to become a priestess. This constant rejection left her feeling ostracized, and the goal of being a priestess transformed into a necessity. She has to save the world, and she has to do it with her own hands, even if that means relying on someone else to make that happen. This confrontation with her own self-doubt leaves Lolo feeling pretty depressed, to say the least. She's a good-natured person at heart, and the idea that she might be unconsciously taking advantage of someone she thinks of as a friend upsets her. In the boss fight that immediately follows the museum, she can't bring herself to lend her power to Klonoa's ring at first, meaning that for the first phase, he can't use his wind bullets. Granted, there aren't any enemies around that are able to be captured, but the point still stands. It takes Popka to talk some sense into her by pointing out that Klonoa's not fighting for some lofty purpose like saving the world, but just following his gut on what he feels is right. He reminds her that she's the same way. She's someone who simply wants to do the right thing. This ignites her motivation and she rejoins the fight, being rewarded with the element of indecision when they succeed. There are only 2 levels and 1 boss fight for this section, but it was able to tell such a great story that highlights the characters and overall themes in such a short period of time. The game as a whole creates these tight, cohesive narrative arcs that align beautifully with the levels that they take place in, and those arcs continue to build on one another. What they build to, well, with all 4 elements in hand, Klonoa and friends return to Master Baguji's island. Master Baguji is the one who prophesied that the Dream Traveler would arrive and save Lunatea. But when they get to the island, they find not him, but someone disguising themselves as him. It's Leorina, and she seizes this opportunity to steal all of our elements. Now, with all 4 in her hands, she intends to use their power to unseal the hidden 5th kingdom and its bell. Huponia, the kingdom of sorrow. If the bell is rung, the entirety of Lunatea could be consumed by the void that makes up this kingdom. What follows are a couple of revisits to old levels. Out of the 15 or so platforming stages in the game, 4 of those are revisits to levels you've already beaten. However, this only happens after something in the story happens that would make going through these places again a mostly new experience, and that new experience hammers in the consequences of the story. I really like the way they're implemented. Going back to the Priestess's Temple in Lalakusha, it's now surrounded by this gross purple ooze. The music is tense and jittery, with an emphasis on dissonant tones. Things are not going well. Once we reach the top of the temple and talk with the High Priestess, she gives us some backstory for Leorina. She used to be a priestess in training, just like Lolo. And just like Lolo, she had her heart and mind totally set on saving the world all on her own. This stubborn attitude led her to leave her training and set off on her own. After going back to the sea where Klonoa first appeared in Lunatea, which is now completely empty and totally dark, and riding down a massive chasm with a surfboard that Popka always seems to have handy, Klonoa and Leorina have their final clash. Both are ultimately fighting to save the world, but their approaches couldn't be more different. Leorina's desperation for more power causes the elements in her possession to go berserk, and she transforms into a monster. What follows is what many people would argue is the best boss fight in the game. Strong narrative stakes, great gameplay, music that brings just the right atmosphere. It's good stuff. After being defeated, Leorina is driven to tears with frustration. She finally realizes that something arbitrary like power isn't what she needs to overcome sorrow. She needs people that she can depend on, and it's something that she already has. It's what Klonoa and Lolo have. She urges us to make our way into the Kingdom of Sorrow and stop its king from destroying Lunatea. After this, there's one last revisit on board a giant flying ark before we arrive in Huponia. Appropriate to the kingdom's title, this place is sad just to look at. Not necessarily because of the constant twilight sky in the background or how decrepit the architecture looks, but because of how empty this place is. Buildings tower high into the sky, windows top to bottom with not a single sign that there's a friendly presence anywhere nearby. And it just keeps going. This is the most difficult platforming in the game, where even one small mistake can set you back. You climb higher and higher and higher, and still there's no sign of anyone. The one word I would use to describe this place is lonely. We do know that there's at least one person here, and it's in the heart of Huponia that we find him. The King of Sorrow isn't really an imposing-looking character at all. In fact, he looks a lot like Klonoa. The most striking difference to me is in how their eyes are portrayed. Klonoa's eyes are filled with energy and life, whereas the King's look exhausted, like he's ready to break down at any moment. His theme music is probably my favorite track in the whole game. It balances feelings of yearning with stoic nobility. He gives us the typical villain speech where he reveals that it was actually him who created the prophecy of the Dream Traveler, all for the purpose of having the elements used to unveil the Kingdom of Sorrow. The people of Lunatea rejected sorrow as a whole. This caused Huponia to essentially disappear from existence. With Klonoa and the elements before him, the king intends to engulf Lunatea in that same sorrow that they refuse to accept. The final boss battle that follows is beautiful. You see, I think this battle is an allegory for Klonoa confronting his own sadness. Without spoiling things, Klonoa 1 ends on a particularly sad note. This world of Lunatea is a dream created around him. We've known this from the very beginning. I already mentioned the obvious similarities in appearance between him and the king. Then there's the fact that during the boss fight, you're never truly attacking the king himself. You're attacking this robot self-defense thing in some strange alternate space, and then you're slowly breaking through a barrier that he's put up to protect himself. You're not trying to hurt him. You're trying to get through to him, which is ultimately what he's wanted all along. The voice Klonoa heard all the way at the very beginning of the game, the one desperately calling out for help, was this sad, lonely being that's now sobbing at our feet. He shares his desire to have sorrow accepted, to have his existence acknowledged. It's a desire that Klonoa happily, delicately fulfills. He promises that never again will Lunatea forget its sorrow. The king finally seems at peace and transforms into the final element. Klonoa rings the kingdom's bell and secures Huponia's place in the world of Lunatea. This right here was the moment everything started to hit all at once for me the first time I played this game as a kid. I wouldn't say I had a bad childhood, but I'd certainly say it was difficult. I had to confront feelings like loneliness, grief, and depression from a really young age. when you first experience those things, it doesn't feel right. There's something very, very wrong that your heart is trying to tell you, but you can't make sense of it. So the easiest thing to do is put those feelings off to the side for the ones that are easier to understand. It's easy to be happy, easy to be calm, easy to be angry, but being sad is complicated. There's this comic I came across on Twitter recently by the artist Twist, who you can find at the handle in the bottom right corner of your screen. It begins with their character, a young child, alone in a dimly lit room playing Ocarina of Time. It's a scene that's all too familiar for me. My favorite place to be growing up was my room. No matter what was going on outside of its walls, it was a space I could always feel safe in and find new adventures in the books and games I was fortunate enough to have. An adult calls out to the child and says they have something they need to talk about. The child's father has passed away from an illness. Upon hearing the news, the child's immediate response is nothing. There's no discernible emotion in their expression whatsoever, and they don't even give any sort of verbal response. Wordlessly, they return to their room and stand in front of their TV screen, staring for who knows how long, before sitting back down and continuing to play their game. Kids have no idea how to process something as difficult as loss. It doesn't even have to be a death necessarily. It could be the end of a friendship, or moving away from people you love. When they're confronted with these feelings, they try to cling to something that they do understand. For the comic's protagonist, myself, and many others, that something was video games. And within the right game, you can find some of the answers you need to keep moving forward. When I was 16 and my mom was dealing with drug addiction, I had Persona 3 and 4 in my life. When I was 11 and a family member was killed by a drunk driver, Pokemon Emerald was there to make sure I was able to still connect with my friends. And when I was 7, moving back and forth across the country a couple times a year while my parents went through a divorce, Klonoa 2 showed me that being sad was okay. What we don't know when we're young is that those feelings of sadness aren't meant to be faced alone. We need people we can trust to share them with, and to do the same in return. That is an invaluable lesson to learn, and it's masterfully depicted in this kids' platforming game where its main character regularly speaks in wahoos. It's one that I know I needed to learn when the game first came into my life. Klonoa 2 would mark the last totally new mainline entry in the franchise's very short history. There was a Wii remake of the first game, some Game Boy Advance spin-offs, and an HD re-release of the aforementioned Wii remake in Klonoa 2, which is where the footage in this video comes from. However, there would be no true Klonoa 3 released, at least at the time of this video's release. Even so, the impact of the few games we do have, and this lovable Traveler of Dreams had on the lives of myself and many others, it'll last forever. They imbued a desire to broaden our horizons, to share our lives with the people we care about, and perhaps most importantly, to truly understand ourselves. I think these are the types of things we need to embrace now more than ever. Even if you watch this video without knowing anything about Klonoa, I still think these games are worth playing for yourself. Maybe you have a younger family member who's into video games that you can share the experience with. Just don't be surprised if you both end up crying.